Welcome to The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky, a weekly podcast that breaks down politics, policy, and current affairs. I'm Michael Brodkorb. Becky is off this week for her fancy wedding. She'll be back on the podcast next week. Joining me today on the podcast is our special guest host, Jeff Kolb. Mike Zipko also joins me for this episode. Mike has worked in the media and then worked in politics for a number of years, including both for the Republican Party of Minnesota as well in communications under Norm Coleman and Governor Arne Carlson. He was also a part of the transition team for Governor Jesse Ventura. Mike is a principal at Velocity Public Affairs, where Becky currently works and where I have done some contract work. Mike has appeared on this podcast in the past, and we rely on him to provide analysis and commentary on the media and public relations. In this episode, we continue our important conversations about the Israel-Hamas war and related local issues by speaking with Ethan Roberts of the Jewish Community Relations Council for Minnesota and the Dakotas. We're going to discuss a couple of topics with Ethan. First, we will break down the antisemitic resolution from the Minneapolis Federation of Teachers, Local 59, about Israel and Palestine that has generated widespread controversy and justified outrage. Second, we're going to discuss with Ethan his perspective on the media coverage of the Israeli-Hamas war. This is the third episode of our podcast on the Israeli-Hamas war since the October 7th terrorist attacks by Hamas on Israel. We spoke with former U.S. Senator Norm Coleman for an episode released on October 17th, and we interviewed Jacob Millner with the American Jewish Committee for an episode released on October 24th about the ongoing threat to Israel and Jews in America, along with the rise of anti-Semitism. Today's episode with Ethan is incredibly powerful, and I hope you listen to every word spoken by him. We will provide links to our other podcast episodes on this topic in the description for this show. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you are moved by Ethan's words as much as Jeff, Mike, and I were during the recording. Thank you. Pleased to be joined today by Ethan Roberts with the JCRC. We're going to talk about a number of issues related to the Israel-Hamas war and some other issues that have arisen from that, some of which are local. And so, Ethan, thank you for joining us today. Appreciate you taking time to talk with us.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you inviting me to be on the show.
I want you to take a minute to give our listeners a little bit of background as to who you are in your organization and why we're talking today.
Sure. I'm the Deputy Executive Director for the Jewish Community Relations Council of Minnesota and the Dakotas. Since 1939, we have been the consensus public affairs voice for our Jewish communities.
What we want to break down first is we want to talk about a resolution that was brought forward and submitted and posted online by the Minnesota Federation of Teachers about as they describe it as the Israeli and Palestinian resolution on Israel and Palestine. And Jeff has been a frequent guest of the podcast and has appeared also as a co-host. Jeff is involved in matters related to some city council, local election issues. Mike is a PR whiz. But Ethan, I want to just give you the floor and talk about this resolution that was put forward by the Minnesota Federation of Teachers from your perspective and and your organization's perspective, why it's so concerning, and we'll chime in and add some discussion points to it.
Sure. Well, so our concerns are the concerns of the hundreds of Jewish parents who've reached out to us, as well as over a dozen teachers, both Jewish and non-Jewish, of the Minneapolis public schools, who first and foremost are wondering is probably too weak a word. They just simply don't understand why the union felt it was necessary at this time to weigh in on the conflict and weigh in on the conflict as they did. So that's the first concern. So before we even start parsing the language that they use, the threshold question is why? Why get involved? I can assure you that nobody in Gaza City or Jerusalem was waiting for the Minneapolis Federation of Teachers to weigh in on this conflict. So they have no impact on the actual fighting and what's going on over there, but they have a tremendous impact on what kind of cultural kind of environment exists at their schools. And the resolution comes at a time of 400% increase in anti-Semitism this time since October 7th compared to October 7th of last year. And we were talking about this morning at one of our meetings. We have a staff of 12 people at the JCRC. 9 of us are working on anti-Semitism as it relates to our schools. 9 of us.
It's terrible.
We have probably spent thousands of hours collectively between the 9 of us on this. Students are being bullied, harassed, threatened. I have spent time at suburban police stations with mothers and 12-year-olds. And much of the hate is coming from social media, and that's like a whole other conversation. Some of it comes from just media, mainstream media. Honestly, not much of it at the K-12 level comes from teachers, right? Not much of it comes certainly from the union purporting to represent teachers. And so if you think about, and Jews, I mean, we're a tiny minority in this state and even in the District of Minneapolis. So if you're one of a handful of Jewish students who is already dealing with bullying and harassment at school and has been dealing with that for 6-7 weeks at this point, the last thing that student needs is another student feeling that they're justified in that hate, in that position, based upon a position taken by the teachers union. So this is making the situation much worse. And it's not also just about the students, it's also about teachers, right? About Jewish teachers who, and teachers and students who are hiding that they're Jewish, right? Hiding symbols that they're Jewish, and really are really struggling. And we want students to know that no matter what the politics of their teacher, every teacher is someone that they can trust. Every teacher is somebody they can go to if they're feeling bullied or harassed. And from the perspective of Jewish teachers, right, they want to know their union is going to have their back. And this is so very problematic for Jewish students, for Jewish families, and for Jewish teachers. And so in our capacity as a consensus public affairs voice for our community, our Jewish community here, we're working directly with parents and we're working directly with teachers.
Ethan, when we spoke, obviously there's a content issue that I have about this resolution. But one of the reasons that I also wanted to discuss this and have Jeff a part of the conversation, Jeff was a member of the Crystal City Council. And one of the conversations that he and I had very early on when he was in elected service was he brought up his perspective, which I agreed with, that it was inappropriate for government bodies, local units of government to issue these kind of resolutions and weigh into these affairs. And so when I saw this resolution, aside from the content, where it came from also raised some concerns. So I want to give Jeff an opportunity to comment on that and offer his perspective.
So one of the things that we did when I was elected to the Crystal City Council is we passed a series of we passed a set of rules for conduct on the council. And one of the things that we did that was a little bit controversial at the time was we banned all resolutions related to things that didn't have a very specific tie to the city of Crystal. And that was in response to kind of what we've seen over the last several years, this growing notion that people who are elected at the municipal level consider themselves to be somewhat kind of super activists, right? They're activists with an election certificate, and they feel that now that I have a platform, I'm going to use that platform to push everything about anything that has nothing to do with my position, but I just want to talk about it. And that was my initial reaction when I saw this was this resolution from the teachers was very much like what Ethan said. There was nobody waiting for this. Nobody was pounding down the door really wanting to know what the Minneapolis Federation of Teachers thought about this conflict. And in fact, quite the opposite was true in that there really was no upside for them to issue something. So, we went so far as to enshrine that in our rules and say, we're not going to do these symbolic resolutions about things that are happening far away. If you want to talk about something that's happening in the city of Crystal, feel free. People have noted the statement from the Minneapolis Federation of Teachers did not mention students in it at all. So there was nothing. This had nothing to do with students. They didn't even go ahead and mention educators. This was basically kind of a far left wing sort of cut and paste statement that really had no business being issued at all. My question for Ethan around this is, the reporting that I saw about the statement itself was fairly cagey about how this came to be and how this happened. Ethan, do you have any insight into, I think the statement I saw was, a majority of the people present at the meeting approved this and thought that it was a good idea or something like that. Do you have any feeling from the feedback you're getting how, I guess I'm trying to get to, how big of a problem do we have within the Minneapolis Federation of Teachers? Is this a widespread problem, or is this a situation where a couple of, really loud weirdos spoke on behalf of everybody else, and then it's become a problem for everybody?
So it's a great question. So the first thing that listeners need to understand is that there was no notice that this was going to come up at the regular monthly union meeting. And so, look, my wife's a teacher, not in the Minneapolis schools, and I don't think she really ever goes to union meetings unless they're getting like an important update on like contract negotiations. Most teachers work way too many hours to attend every monthly meeting, especially when there's no particular reason to attend a meeting. So taking advantage, I think, of the fact that their rules allow for a resolution to come from the floor without being on the agenda and voted on at that meeting, they were able to pass this, and it was like overwhelming support because nobody spoke out in opposition to it. And we know that if this had been on the agenda and there had been an opportunity for people to speak against it, the vote would have not necessarily gone the way it did, because one of the people that we're working with right now is someone who voted for the resolution. He didn't know. He didn't understand, right? It was brought up. It was quickly dispensed with. It sounded good. I mean, on the surface, who isn't for a ceasefire, right? I mean, we should get into what the consequences of a ceasefire are without the return of the hostages, but it sounds good. And if you're like a math teacher, like you're not an expert in the Middle East, why not? So the first, I think, so I do think that there is a significant issue with the leadership who was speaking, who allowed this to happen, whose rules allowed this to happen. But in a union of, I think, of about 3,000 members, maybe 80 voted on it. So it's going to be very interesting what happens on Wednesday, because on Wednesday is our next monthly meeting. And we're working with Jewish and non-Jewish teachers who are bringing forward a resolution, which they're sharing with everyone. So everyone knows this is going to be on the agenda, and they even know what the language looks like, right? So they don't have to do that, but they're modeling what it's like to have fair process. My expectation and understanding is that the union is probably going to need to revisit these rules to allow for a better process. But those are the rules we have. But I think there's a reason why the interim president is being cagey, because the process is embarrassing. It's an embarrassing process.
And every organization of any type that needs to look. And nobody ever wants to talk about the rules. It's boring. People think you're a crazy person when you talk about the rules. I've been to enough political conventions where somebody stands up and they're like, "Oh, Rule 3.2.7 says blah blah blah," but they're important because specifically for this reason that you can't, when you are an organization like that, to allow, agenda items that don't have any notice, or things to be voted on from the floor with a small majority, or with again 3,000 members and 80 people pass this particular resolution. It just makes the organizations look bad, and good governance is something that I think every organization needs to look at. It's one of those things that, again, like nobody wants to be the Robert's Rules guy, but somebody has to, and somebody has to be the one to say, no, guys, we actually have to do this in a way that makes sense. I hope to see a large pushback from this. I'm not holding my breath. I think apathy wins out over anything else, and it will be interesting to see what does happen. Going
well, the
forward.
Teachers that we're working with have it actually does center students, and it centers families, and it centers educators. And the key piece of it, it's like 4 paragraphs, is, and I think they're being gracious to teachers, because they start with, while it was not MFT members' intent, the Israel-Palestine resolution passed at our October 25 meeting harmed many Jewish members, students, and families while causing unnecessary division within our union. We regret this. Every single part of that except for perhaps the part about not being their intent, it's hard to know what their intent was, is unassailably true, right? It has harmed many Jewish members, students, and families. It has caused division, which I think people would generally think is unnecessary, right, within the union. And if you agree with that, then you should regret it. I'm not a progressive. I consider myself to be left of center, but I've learned to speak progressive. And my understanding is that, for progressives, you don't get to challenge someone else's perceived narrative, their truth, right? So it would be interesting to say to a Jewish fellow member, you haven't been harmed. When someone says, I feel harmed, right? And clearly many family members and students have said, we feel harmed. There is not unanimity. And this is why it was important, I think, to say that JCRC is a consensus public affairs voice. Jewish community, like any community, but maybe especially so, we don't have unanimity on many issues. We certainly don't have unanimity on Israel or Zionism. But we are speaking here for the 80% plus perspective. And so it is, again, unassailably true that many members were harmed. Many students and families were harmed. And this is, I think, a very gracious resolution from these members so that they're not trying to overly embarrass their leadership and enable them to honestly issue the apology that they should have done already.
This will be voted on. Go ahead, Mike.
I think, unfortunately, Ethan, what you're seeing has been something that's been building up for quite a while. Resolutions are getting put in front of city councils, and kind of what Jeff said, but in Minneapolis and St. Paul, people are taking advantage of progressive majorities on these councils, and whether it's related to energy, climate change, things like this that are done with small numbers of an organization pushing something through. There's been a number of situations we've had to deal with in the past where they suspend the rules at a city council meeting to pass a resolution, which then creates this idea that a city or a union or a larger organization supports these ideas. And the problem is, I think this has been going on for quite a while in Minneapolis and St. Paul. Unfortunately, it rose to a level here with this issue, where the intensity of this issue is far beyond whether an oil pipeline should be built. This is something at a higher level. But this has been happening for a while. And I think what you're doing by being the voice for the 80% of the people who don't support this, that really matters, because the challenge is to find the voice for those who are saying, I'm not okay with this. And can you find enough of them and activate them? Because it ends up being a small number of people. And the hard part is you're playing defense when you don't even know the game is on sometimes. And all of a sudden the resolution pops out.
It's been whack-a-mole, since October 7th. Every day brings something new. When I say 80%, I mean, I'm definitely referring to 80% in the Jewish community. I mean, depending on how the question is asked and when the question is asked, the numbers may be different. But let's get into the content, if we can, about this resolution. Yes. Because it's not just that it's inappropriate that they're weighing in. I mean, again, if you wanted to issue some sort of resolution, it would be like, we support our students, particularly our Jewish, Muslim, Israeli, and Palestinian students, because we know that they're really hurting right now. That would be appropriate. We're against anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and the other isms. That would be appropriate, right? But, this idea, I mean, let's just take the last sentence first. The BDS movement is a peaceful and powerful way to effect lasting positive change in the region. Let's be clear here. The boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement has the exact same goal as Hamas. Different means, same goal. And my boss and I were just talking about the fact that on Wednesday, it's going to be exactly like 76 years since the rejection of the two-state solution 1.0, or depending if you want to count the Peel partition, there are other partitions, but the UN resolution to partition the British mandate in Palestine, which of course the Arabs rejected. For 76 years plus, they have been basically bashing their head against a wall. And the reason they've been bashing their head against a wall and thinking that through terrorism, violence, economic boycotts, they can essentially destroy, remove Israel is this: the premise of the BDS movement and the premise of Hamas is that Israel is like this settler, colonial, foreign entity which has invaded the Muslim Middle East. And if they put enough pressure, enough terrorism, Israel will go away, right? Israelis will go home. And it's a failure to understand Israelis as they understand themselves, or Jews as we understand ourselves, that they are home. Israelis are home. That is their home. That is where Judaism, the word Jew literally comes from Judea. Our religion, our language, our holidays. I mean, Hanukkah, which everyone wants to celebrate, right? In like less than 2 weeks, it's literally a celebration of the restoration of Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel. So because they delude themselves into thinking who we are, they engage in tactics that don't work and get them nowhere. And this is what when I was emailing you guys in advance of this, the necessity of breaking the wheel, right? Stop doing the same thing over and over again. Hamas attacks Israel. Israel defends itself. Palestinians die. Wash and repeat, wash and repeat, wash and repeat. Somebody needs to tell. I mean, Hamas, they're very obviously impossible to talk to because they're psychopathic Nazi killers. But the BDS movement and their allies, your tactics are counterproductive. Forget, you don't care about Israelis, fine. If you purport to care about Palestinians, you're not helping them. All you're doing is pushing Israel further, like it just makes it much harder for them to have any trust that there could be any peace. So that is a huge problem with this. As you mentioned earlier, Jeff doesn't mention students or educators any other place. They only condemn the U.S. government. They can't condemn Hamas. And finally, there's much more we could talk about, but anyone who is demanding a ceasefire that is not demanding a release of the hostages, that is morally bankrupt.
Correct.
Again, nobody's paying attention in Gaza City and Jerusalem what they're saying anyway. So why not throw in, right, and release all the hostages? It's a great question, right? Nobody's given us an answer.
No, I would agree. And I would say to you, the reason why I wanted to spend a couple minutes discussing the process of how this resolution came about, it shows tremendous disrespect to the issue and the process that was laid out. And then when you get to actually what the resolution is, it's just horrific. It's just horrific. Your letter, you sent a letter last week to the leadership signed by parents, students, staff, alumni, taxpayers,
right?
Everyone, yes. And you noted that the resolution also refused to condemn the brutal the attack by Hamas, that it failed to demand the release of the hostages, which you noted. It endorsed the BDS movement, demonizes Jews by placing sole blame for the conflict on Israel, and uses highly inaccurate language to denigrate Israel, and ignores the fact that Israel is central to the identity to the vast majority of Jews. Talk about some of those other areas of this resolution that were so insensitive.
So the premise that we need to have a ceasefire now, while ignoring that we had a ceasefire on October 6th before Hamas crossed an international border. Look, the status of the West Bank, you want to call it Palestine, you want to call it Judea and Samaria, you want to call it the occupied territory, that is a whole other conversation. The communities in southern Israel along the Gaza border are all within the 1940, 48, 49 armistice lines, right? This is Israel. This is recognized by everyone as Israel. And so crossing an international border, when there was a ceasefire in place, very intentionally engaging in the most horrific, barbaric acts of sadism, murdering children in front of their parents in front of their children, burning children alive, rape as a weapon, right? That is completely unacknowledged in this, right? They're holding on the same moral plane, Israel, which is defending itself, and the violence of Hamas. This would be like holding the SS or the Eisengruppen, right, or Dr. Mengele in World War II on the same moral plane as the United States Army Air Force, right? That's
Ethan,
exactly what they're doing.
Can I ask, because you rattled off a number of just unimaginable atrocities, right? Which I think, again, a lot of times people think about this stuff in the abstract and they don't actually think about what really happened. Those words that you just said: murdering children, murdering parents in front of their children, rape as a weapon, right? Those are things that you said. Do you believe the people making these ridiculous statements and issuing these proclamations and all of that, do they not think that happened? Do they think it's justified? Do they just not think about it? I mean, what is that? Because I struggle to get in the mindset of someone who can look at people who take hostages and think, oh, that's the good guys. Right? I can't get past that mental block, right? I just go, okay, so if you're taking hostages, then if you're taking children and elderly people hostage, then you're the bad guy. That's pretty clear, right? To me, there's a lot of moral clarity. Do you have any insight into why? What is that? Why do people?
I think it exists on a spectrum. I think there are people who are going to deny it. If you look at the University of Minnesota and you look at the most radical department on campus, which is the Gender Women's Studies department, embedded in their their statement, was that, and I'm paraphrasing here, but to accuse Muslims of engaging in, I believe they use the word acts of barbarism, is Islamophobic. So in other words, a department, yes, you're looking at me like the viewers can't see this because we're just listening. They're listeners, not viewers. Michael's looking at me like, what? I'm like, exactly, right? So the level of gaslighting, and this extends itself to the fact that there's been a lot of discussion in Israeli Jewish circles about the fact that the United Nations has multiple bodies designated for the welfare of the rights of women, all been silent, right? Largely the Me Too movement has been silent. And so there's this tremendous sense of betrayal, right, and of gaslighting. And remember there was like, but where's the evidence? It's like, remember they're like, where's the evidence that babies' heads were cut off or babies were burned, right? They are still literally identifying bodies right now because they were charred, right? They were mutilated and they were burned. And they identified one person, they know that she's dead just because they found a fragment of her skull, right? This beautiful woman who was, like at least like 300 of the victims were at like a dance party, right, in the desert, who were like, the other thing that like people like these progressives, they can't wrap their mind around is that so many of the Israeli victims were progressives, right? They were feminists. They were people who were utopian, like peaceniks who that's a Hebrew word, peacenik, right? Who wanted to, literally, it's the word, who wanted to live on the border with Gaza so that they could help the people of Gaza by like ferrying them to doctor's appointments so they can employ them, which was weaponized against these communities because some of the people they employed clearly had mapped out these farming communities so they knew exactly where to go. And so, yes, some people deny it, and then other people try to excuse it, right? Well, what do you expect? They're living under occupation. Again, Gaza is not under occupation. Israel withdrew all of its forces, all of its settlers in 2005. Well, I don't know. I guess expect that you don't rape women. I guess we expect that you don't burn children in front of their parents and parents in front of their children. Guess we expect, they murdered parents and then they kidnapped the traumatized 3-4-year-olds. Why would you even want to have a 3 to 4-year-old to take care of whose parents you just murdered? We've been, it's been very obviously heartwarming to see the release of, at this point, it looks like in today it's going to move forward. It's been 30 plus. No, we're closer to 50 at this point. About 40 Israeli hostages, mainly children and women. But understand that every one of these people who was being returned has family members that were killed probably in front of them, right? Or have family members who are still being held hostage. And so the barbarism's the point, right? That was the idea, is to terrorize Israelis. Again, if it's this anti-colonial playbook, right, which is what, was done in, let's say, Algeria, or what was done in Vietnam, this is actually smart in a very evil sort of way, right? You make life so atrocious for that colonial power that they go back to the mother country. Except for it's not a colony, right? And so actually, I was listening to the podcast this morning, Times Israel. There's a strong belief that the communities, these farming communities, not only are people going to return, people are going to want to move to those communities. The population is going to actually grow. So you asked a question, do they not see it? Some of them refuse to see it, right? Some of them just try to contextualize it. Some of them try to excuse it. But it's moral cowardice not to call it out, right? If you want my attention on a ceasefire, the least you can do is call for all hostages to be returned and condemn Hamas. If you cannot do those two things, there's no point in even having a conversation.
I think, Ethan, one of the things where this speaks to it, even at a higher level, there's the ability where don't let facts get in the way. You build causes around emotion and you basically reshape the argument. And it happens a lot. And you unfortunately have a number of people who either want to believe the misinformation or don't take the time on their own to find out what the real facts are, which then allows them to have the emotional certainty of what they're doing. And things become a scrum rather than a conversation because they're all involved in this, in one position or one point of view, and they're not going to pay attention to facts that disagree with the perception that they have. And so now you're trying to convince people that what they feel is wrong as opposed to what they know is wrong. And that's the challenge, which is what we need to start thinking about, how to start countering that, because that is the challenge. Trying to say to somebody who's emotionally invested in an outcome that their outcome is wrong, because, and here are the facts, becomes a challenge, because in their position, they've locked in from a cause-related point of view that this is what they believe. And I would bet that within the teachers union, there's probably a small number of people who are, hard enough edged on this to say, we're going to push this thing through because we're so committed passionately to this position. And if these other facts become things that counter their argument, they're not going to pay attention to them, or they're going to ignore them, because that cuts in the way of the emotional intensity of what they're believing in.
Yeah,
Mike,
absolutely.
That's a great point. I feel, and I need to reflect on what you said for a second, because it is such a great point, because I think a lot of times people think, and we see this on a number of issues, right? Crime, inflation, that if you just fact people, you just throw facts at them, that they will change their mind because you've shown them that you're correct. And that's not how people work. That doesn't happen. And so I don't know. We could go probably talk for hours about that and what the right counter arguments are. I wanted to mention one thing, just because it popped into my head as we were talking here. The number that, we've had a lot of conversation about misinformation the last several years. And so when we're talking about people building their position on something based on emotion, when they're sold a story that's absolutely false, and then they come to their conclusion on what happened based on incorrect information. The one that's been going around, and you've seen it if you're on social media at all, is this woman who was released. She was a prisoner who was released from prison in Israel with the deformed face, right?
Right.
And the stories that are being told about her and what the Israeli government did to her, and then when you dig in and you find out her face is deformed because she was a suicide bomber and her bomb went off before she intended it to, and not only so she disfigured herself, and then not only that, but then the Israeli government has paid for 2 reconstructive surgeries for her face, but refused the third one, and they're supposed to be the bad guys. So I think, when you get these things that take kind of legend status, and facts are irrelevant, and this all dovetails into the role of TikTok and social media and all of this, and how maybe foreign powers are manipulating things. And then I start sounding like a tinfoil hat person, but I believe this is all real.
But that works though, because people are able to be manipulated because they've either disconnected themselves from the real facts. I mean, social media works to move a position on an opinion, in part because people aren't connected to the facts that used to anchor them to what was the reality. And we're now at a point now where persuasion, I think, has become a lost art in this kind of propaganda battle. And, and in this case, Hamas and others in the progressives are much quicker to activate on this. They're quicker to get on the ground with an easy to digest narrative where you're left with a factual counter to an emotional point. And facts versus emotion are really, really hard. In this case, what Ethan and your organization are dealing with, you're dealing with families and teachers and parents who feel uncomfortable by this. But the hard part is, I think the other team didn't really care whether people felt uncomfortable or not. They were going to go ahead with this. And if people felt uncomfortable, so be it. They got a moral merit badge.
Well, my sense is that they don't really understand the mainstream Jewish community. I think that what happens is that in these progressive circles, you'll always find overrepresented the 10, 20% of the community that agrees, right? And so this tokenization, like, well, I talked to so-and-so, who's Jewish, right? And so-and-so, is a rabbi in one particular case, right? The person who interrupted the President Biden's fundraiser. And yes, of course, we're not, a complete monolith, right? There is diversity of thought, but the question becomes, again, for progressives, in what other context would you amplify the voice of any marginalized community of a viewpoint within that community, which is 10 to 20%, over the other 80, 90%, right? Never. They would never do that, right? And so what is it about the Jewish community? And this is really at the heart of of the work at the JCRC, which is explaining Jewish identity and anti-Semitism, and how these two things kind of connect to each other, and how anti-Semitism operates in some ways like other isms, but in other ways is very different. And progressives are their worldview is who's ever less powerful is, by virtue of being less powerful, more right. And if you look at the conflict
Great point.
if you look at the
Yep.
conflict between Israel and Palestinians, or Israel-Hamas, Israel obviously has a much larger standing army. If you would to open your aperture and you would look at the entire Middle East, and particularly if you would bring Iran into the equation, right, or Hezbollah into the equation, it looks quite different. But also, if you consider what is the power of an enemy that is so ruthless that they are perfectly content to kill your civilians and then dare you to kill their civilians as they hide behind them, right? There's an asymmetry of power there that, no nation has figured out, right? And so it takes a lot of work, it takes a lot of explanation, a lot of conversation, a lot of trust to kind of get people to kind of think about this in a different way and to understand that, especially from the arc of Jewish history, we never really feel that secure, right? And by the way, if you're trying to argue that Israel shouldn't exist and that Jews don't need Israel, being really anti-Semitic in the diaspora in places like Minneapolis public schools is not a great way to convince us, right? You're just proving the point of why Israel needs to exist.
One of those topics that we wanted to discuss was media coverage of the Israeli-Hamas war, how it's been perceived by everyone in this discussion today. Ethan, I'd like to start with you to give your take on how you think the media coverage, both locally, nationally, and internationally, has covered the war, the atrocities from your perspective.
Well, let's start with the positive. Locally, I think that much of the coverage has been really pretty good. On multiple occasions, especially at some of the local TV stations, Star Tribune have reached out to us. They said, "Hey, can you comment on this things that's happening?" Or, what's your perspective? Or, "Hey, what stories, do you think we're missing?" I think they're really trying at the local level to be balanced, to be sensitive, and while I wouldn't say that every local outlet is equally great, I think overall the picture here in Minnesota is really pretty good. When we go internationally or nationally is where the coverage is literally getting people killed to some extent. So let's take the infamous attack, bombing, right? Israel bombed a hospital, right? Which the New York Times, the Washington Post, the BBC just took on face value, right? That Israel did it because Hamas said so, right? Gazan sources, Hamas claims, as though the people who had just, and this was like a week after the atrocities of October 7th, like they're like trustworthy and believable, as though they weren't aware, which they obviously were, that there's a proven track record of Hamas Islamic Jihad rockets failing to cross the border, landing and killing Palestinian civilians. And that sidetracked the president's trip. He was supposed to, remember, go to all these Arab countries he couldn't.
Yeah.
Right? People, there was concern about evacuating the U.S. embassy in Beirut. Right? It was really serious. And, Al Jazeera, which is basically Qatari state media, and Pravda, whatever, the Russia Today, right? They're going to be terrible. The Chinese are going to be terrible. But to have these pillars of supposedly objective professional journalism just falling for this hook, line, and sinker. And this is a challenge, right? Because a lie, as Mark Twain quipped, right, can get, halfway around the world before the truth gets its pants on. Israel needed like a couple hours to come up with all of the evidence that, was needed to convince the U.S. government and to convince, honestly, much of the media that they had gotten the story completely wrong. But interestingly, I was just reading today that the BBC reporter has no regrets, right? And they're like, "Well,
Yes,
you were wrong." But the best part too was like, they're like, "And you even claimed that the hospital was flattened and it landed in a parking lot." He's like, "Well, okay, that was wrong, but from the information I had, what was the information you had? You weren't there, right?" And so this, of course, though, the reason why they believe this is because they're primed to believe the worst of Israel and to be completely incredulous when it comes to the claims for people who had just engaged in the worst atrocities since the Holocaust. So there's that level of bias, and that's obviously the worst form of bias. But then there's also recency bias, right? Which we see in all sorts of contexts. Like whatever happened today is by far the only thing we need to care about. Forget what happened 5 weeks ago. And there's also the kind of if it bleeds, it leads bias, right? Disaster bias. And so really sorry that, more Israelis aren't dying, right, since October 7th, and that the IDF is actually taking measures to protect its troops. Maybe then the world would be more sympathetic. It's not a calculus. I mean, Israelis would much prefer, if they had to choose, between being pitied because they're being killed and being despised because they're fighting back. Better to live and be despised than to be dead in pity. But here we actually have hostages, right? Who, if you look at it again to bring the conversation in full circle back to the MFT, they can't even mention them. Now, interestingly, over the weekend, because of the release of hostages, which is a very, very painful deal for Israel, because militarily they absolutely have Hamas on the ropes, and Hamas clearly did not agree to this out of the good graciousness. And it's not to get their people released either, although that has symbolic value. They're literally getting creamed in Gaza, and they needed this time to regroup and to resupply, and to figure out what on earth they're going to do next. But Israel did this because Israel values the lives of its civilians above all else. So with this coverage, you sort of see that, okay, there's now a little bit more positive media coverage, for the weekend. But again, this is a story of Israeli victims. So, in order to be covered well in the media, I suppose Israel just needs to be a better job of being a victim. But why would you want to be a victim? Why would you want your civilians to die? Hamas, by contrast, has figured out that they're winning, quote unquote, when they're the victims, when they purposely allow their civilians to die. Billions of dollars for tunnels for them, nothing for the civilians, embedding themselves in civilian infrastructure and launching rockets from that infrastructure, starting a war they have no chance of winning. And the media fall for it, right? And so again, this is what I mean by breaking the wheel. What if people said, yes, all of this devastation in Gaza is terrible, and it's absolutely Hamas's fault, and we need to do everything we can to put pressure on Hamas, which means putting pressure on their allies like Qatar. And, not to be too political, but which members of Congress have a very special relationship with Qatar and have been really silent on Qatar?
Correct. Well, and one thing, Ethan, I can tell you this from having worked in newsrooms, but I have a very good friend of mine who's a consultant and works with TV stations around the country. And the newsrooms are filled with younger people now who have come through a higher ed system that has demonized Israel. And they come with preloaded biases, and the audience of people who Hamas is reaching may not be the general public, but it's people who work in newsrooms and people who are, even within the White House itself are having, there's conflicts within there. But looking at how newsrooms operate, I think the younger audiences of people who are the producers making these decisions have a preconceived idea of what the story is. The thing that really frustrates me, and I'd shared this with Michael before, when the attack happened at the hospital, the media clearly got it wrong. They went to great lengths to not say specifically they got the story wrong, because one of the things that decreases credibility in the media is they have an incredibly hard time to admit we made a mistake, we got a story wrong, which then basically allows the people on the farther extreme say, see, you can't trust the media. Here, I think you're seeing the same situation where these newsrooms are kind of tripping over themselves to try and figure out how to cover this. And the higher you go nationally, I think it's a bigger challenge. It's interesting in the Twin Cities right now to see how they're struggling to try and find some balance here to cover this. But even then, they struggle with this too, because I guarantee you the people in the newsroom, especially some of the younger producers and others, have a perspective that's more of an advocate rather than a fact finder. And these stories, one side of the story has more emotional purchase than the facts. It gets back to the other part of the conversation. So I think the fact that what you guys are doing as an organization is really important, because if you're not there with real people and real voices to try and call this stuff out or challenge it, it's going to get embedded even farther than it already is. And as for the national media coverage, international media coverage, I mean, they were New York Times and Associated Press hired stringers who were on motorcycles riding on the attacks on October 7th and claimed that they didn't know these people, that the material they got from these stringers came from people who almost had to have known in advance that the attacks were coming. They went through a grinding out process to figure out what should they do to hire freelancers, to the point where the New York Times fired one of them. But in and of themselves, they had to admit they made a mistake. But it's really, really hard for a media enterprise to say, you know what, we got it wrong, because it's almost like they can't get past that wall of that position. And unfortunately, it takes a lot of outside groups pushing to say, by the way, you did get it wrong. And it's frustrating.
The media in the case of Gaza and Hamas really owes their viewers or listeners the necessary context to understand that any civilian in Gaza is far more afraid of Hamas than they are of Israel. And so if a doctor is saying, like in Al Shifa Hospital, there's no Hamas activity here, well, what is he going to say, right? If he says the truth, he's dead, right? Or his family's dead. I mean, that's just how it works. And if you're working, with a stringer, right? If they don't toe the Hamas line, they're also dead. And so what the media owe their viewers and listeners to say, look, the sources that we're dealing with may be all under duress, right? The sources we're dealing with are living or working, including, international aid organizations, right? That Hamas runs the show here. They're not just terrorists. They're a terrorist government, right? And so it is kind of incredible that the other thing too, of course, also about that hospital was that the exact number. They knew exactly how many people had been killed. 500. Right?
Instantaneously.
How on earth did they know that? Israel still didn't. I mean, to their credit, a country is an actual responsible democracy when they actually lower a number because that's what the facts indicate. So for the longest time, Israel believed it was 1,400 dead people on October 7th. And then they realized it was actually closer to 1,200. Because that's where the facts. Now, it was not easy for them to identify the bodies, which we discussed earlier. But, it's like, why not just say 5,000 people were killed? Why not 500,000 people were killed? I mean, someone out there is going to buy it, right? I mean, it is absolutely pathetic. And so, it is such a struggle. And it's like even terminology, like, the BBC and others, I just heard this today on the current, I was driving into work, militants. I am sorry. Why is it so difficult to call them terrorists? If what we talked about earlier, is not terrorism, then the word terrorism is devoid of all meaning.
We've talked many, many times about media bias and the way that media bias presents itself. And I think there are some really, really obvious ways that bias presents itself in terms of, that anyone could see, but it's the smaller everyday, it's the death by 1,000 paper cuts piece that people don't always see, and that's one of it. And word choice is a way that happens, where you see that, and people may not necessarily catch that, but it's absolutely shaping the narrative, and it's doing it from a biased standpoint. One of the things that one of my I don't know, pet peeves. It's not a pet peeve. It's a pet cause, I guess, talking about basically the democratization of media. And, Michael and I are very big about kind of whatever you want to call it, the new media, the alternative media, the alternatives to the traditional large news organizations who have definitely declined in recent years. And I love a lot about the democratization of media and how it allows individuals to get stories out. And we're in some sense, we're all the media. But the flip side of that comes to it becomes very hard to know who to trust and who is actually, who's a reliable person. Ethan, do you have any, do you have any, is there a list, or is there some kind of, if we're looking for accurate information on this topic, is there something that you would point to that is a good source on the media side of things, or somebody that does a better job anyway, if we're grading on a curve?
I think the Times of Israel does a fantastic job, and there's no paywall. It is a nonprofit, but they'll gladly take a little bit of money from people, but you don't have to pay. I know the founding editor. I know some of the analysts and some of their staff. I think they do they're very professional. One of the things that's interesting is that the far left will also say this is Bibi's war, right? As though 90+% of Israelis aren't absolutely seeing this exactly the same way, that the hostages must be returned. Hamas they cannot live next to Hamas. Well, Times of Israel has, their founding editor and others have been very vocal critics of Bibi Netanyahu up till October 7th. In the wake of October 7th, and is seen as this profound failure. So this is not the mouthpiece of Bibi's government, but it gives you a pretty good sense of centrist perspective. I think Jeff Goldberg at The Atlantic does a great job in terms of the pieces that he's pulling together. I think I sent you guys earlier a piece from Tablet from Madi Friedman. I mean, look, every paper will have individuals. I think, for example, David French, who is a really interesting conservative with a very solid JAG background, that his analysis about the laws of war, which are not what people think they are, right, in terms of proportionality, were really helpful. I did cancel my Washington Post subscription. I just couldn't deal with their absurd bias anymore, and a lot of people are pointing this out. But they have some good columnists there as well. It's interesting. We were talking earlier about that Palestinian would-be suicide bomber, right? With the scar face. There was literally images, not just from social media, but I don't want to name who it was because I can't remember. It was definitely very mainstream media where it was like a split screen. It was like a child, an Israeli child, and her. And this is to bring it back to the language of MFT, right? We condemn violence, like we're all the same. Like a child, right, attending a friend's birthday party or whatever they were doing in their home, and somebody who tried to kill children. They're not the same. And when you use the same language for them, or you put them on the same plane, we're all dumber for it.
Correct. And not all sides are equal.
No.
There is not a balance between right and wrong on both sides. And this engagement in both sidesism has been just incredibly ugly to see. Mike?
The only other thing to me that's really sophisticated related to this is the propaganda battle related to hearts and minds. I mean, Hamas is skilled on the propaganda side because they can make an emotionally based charge. But what Israel has done, and by getting the videos that Hamas recorded and sharing that with members of Congress and other people around the country here, is really important. It's another way to kind of not fight back, but push back to at least establish that what happened actually did happen. And it's, but the propaganda battle is what drives a lot of the media coverage. And your point about Hamas controlling things for that article you sent around is really important for people to see. It reminds me a little bit of Baghdad Bob from the days of the Gulf War, where he was Saddam's spokesperson. No matter what was going on, the answer was always positive and pay no attention to the facts around here. And I think we're at a different level of sophistication that social media makes it harder to deal with, but it also forces everybody to have their own filter now. I think before you could count on the media being a filter for things. Now you have to do it yourself.
How would we have ever won World War II if we had the social media that we have today and the sensibilities that we have today? Like, how soon would people have been saying ceasefire now with Hitler, right? Or outrage for the people of Dresden, right? Or the people of Berlin. I'm sorry. I wish there was a way to defeat evil without innocent people being hurt. That's not how it works in the real world, especially for an enemy like Hamas. It is always in Israel's best interest to minimize the death of innocent Palestinian civilians. It demonstrably does not work well for Israel when Palestinian civilians die. But if the consequence of that is that Hamas just gets to continue ruling Gaza, and if they've already said what happened on October 7th, we're going to do again and again and again, no country would tolerate that. And how on earth could there be a ceasefire now when there's still about 200 hostages, right? And they're so cruel, they're so barbaric that they separated one of these young girls from her mother just 2 days ago. The whole agreement was that they were not supposed to do that. But of course, an agreement with Hamas is worth, as we saw on October 7th, less than nothing.
To your statement about World War II, Jeff and I have had that exact same conversation. I've discussed it multiple times in my house with my family, just out of outrage as to how I've seen some of the media coverage. It's been hearing you speak about this, what you're living and what you're experiencing, Ethan, it's just unimaginable. And the images that people have seen on TV, what I've seen on TV, what family members have seen on TV, what you've seen on TV, I just can't imagine going through this experience. And it has created, I think, a real need for a larger discussion after the hostages are back, where there is a larger ongoing conversation about the rise of anti-Semitism and how Jews and Israel are viewed by, I think, a number of institutions in this country and people. It is horrific what I've seen, and I can't imagine it from your perspective.
It's been terrible, and at the same time, I am so impressed with the resiliency of the Minnesota Jewish community. I'm so impressed with the resiliency of the American community, the diaspora community, and of course, Israelis. I'm seeing so many people who don't hold like formal, like they don't have a job like I do, right? They're not the deputy executive director of the JCRC, who are stepping up, right? Who are organizing their friends and neighbors. There's been now 2 weekends in a row, a march with strollers around the lakes in Minneapolis with the I'm going to show it to you, but it's radio, so it's audio. It doesn't make any difference. With the posters of the kidnapped Israelis in these empty strollers, particularly children. We didn't organize that. Like we're helping them, but like that's incredible. And you saw this largest like peaceful protest movement in Israel, the brothers and sisters in arms who were opposing judicial overhaul, overnight basically become civil society. Overnight, the largest distribution of goods, because there are 200,000 plus Israelis who have been displaced internally live in Israel, and they need literally everything. And Israelis, and also a ton of money has been raised in diaspora here in the Twin Cities. Like it's like $13 million for humanitarian relief. And so, yes, this is in many ways the worst of times. But I'm very proud to be Jewish. I'm very proud of our community. I love being Jewish, and I want my kids, and they do as well, to love being Jewish. And we often kind of end conversations or kind of our statements with 3 Hebrew words: Am Yisrael Chai, the people of Israel. That doesn't mean Israelis. That means all Jews live. We live, and we will continue to live, not despite of, but because not despite of our enemies, but because we love being Jewish and we love life.
These were not topics when Becky and I started the podcast that we expected to delve into, and we've done 3 shows on this, and every one of them is very difficult. And it's very difficult to hear what you're experiencing and to have these type of conversations. They're important. We need to have them. I think it would be disrespectful if we did not have these conversations and provide a platform for you, your organization, and anyone who supports your cause to speak up, because that's where we can be helpful and be partners. I have been so impressed by my church, others in my community, that the circles that my family and I travel in have been incredibly supportive and want to be supportive to the cause. But there is an element of ugliness, and what some of the topics that you just touched on and some of the descriptions are just really difficult to hear. And it's really important that I think people understand the brutality of what's gone on, and also know that there needs to be support for you, your organization, for Jewish people all across this state, this nation, and for the state of Israel. How are you doing through this? And I also want to note what's going to happen on Wednesday, and in particular, what more can people do?
Well, people can contact their members of Congress, right? They need to hear from people. They're hearing from the angry minority. They need to hear from the sensible majority. So absolutely, this is, contact your Republican members, your Democratic members, like, our senators, right? Whoever your representative is, and just basically express support that, could just simply be, I stand with Israel, and the United States must continue to have Israel's back. That's a really simple message to just tally it. You guys all know this. You've worked in politics. You don't need to give them a long speech, right? You're just talking to a 24-year-old. They're just keeping a tally. How am I doing? I hate to complain. It's sort of because, compared to my friends, family in Israel, right? The people I love there, every night I go to bed and I don't have to worry about anything, my own safety or the safety of my family, of my kids. It is very stressful. We are working basically nonstop, but it's a tremendous privilege to have this position, right? At this time, it is a lot of responsibility, but it is mainly a privilege. And we all we look at what's happening there. We feel mostly, we all kind of feel useless. I only feel mostly useless, not completely useless, because I have work I can do here. So, should I exercise more and eat better and sleep more? Absolutely. But overall, I, as I said, I love being Jewish, and I love the work I do at the JCRC with my colleagues. We have a tremendous team with a great leader in Steve Hunnigs, and a very supportive board. I mean, our board, like, they brought us meals. We just moved our offices. Like, that's why there's nothing behind me. Not that your listeners can see that. They helped us unpack, right? Because like, well, what can we do? I'm like, well, we have all these boxes. Can you help us unpack? So, and the community has been very appreciative. So overall, in the midst of this horror, I think we're holding up okay. But thank you for asking.
What is going to happen? You discussed there's going to be a Wednesday, and then what can people do? Let's discuss Wednesday. What's happening on Wednesday?
There's two things on Wednesday. First, the State Board of Investment is meeting on Wednesday morning. They meet quarterly. This is the governor, the attorney general, who my understanding is not going to be in town, the Secretary of State, and the state auditor. They are the State Board of Investment. There is going to be the quarterly call to divest from Israel bonds and from also companies that, like Israeli companies. It's not going to go anywhere, but they're going to be loud, and so we're planning a response to that.
I have seen some of the very ugly wanted posters.
Yeah.
Floating around on social media.
I haven't even seen those yet, but I'll have to look for them.
Yeah.
But then in the evening, the teachers are having their monthly meeting, and we're not formally part of that. I'm not a member of education of the union. They seem well prepared. They're talking to their friends. They're talking to their colleagues within the union. They're having good conversations. You really have to do this work. One teacher to one teacher to one teacher. Again, strong allies from teachers who are not Jewish for a variety of reasons. And we'll see. But I'm proud of how they're going about this by being transparent, right? Getting this on the agenda so people know what's going to be on the agenda, getting the language out there, being positive, and focusing on kids. So I think in that way they've already won. But we'll see. It's like caucuses, right? It's like who shows up. Right.
Is it open to the public?
It is not open to the public. It is just for members, which we, of course, respect that. Also contact the governor. The governor has been great, and express your appreciation to him. Contact, I would say, you could contact the speaker and Melissa Hortman and Majority Leader and thank them as well. They've also been supportive. So far, Congress is, with a few notable exceptions here in Minnesota, been pretty good. But if you live in Congresswoman Omar's district or Congresswoman McCollum's district, it would be worth asking, why do you expect everything of Israel and nothing of Hamas, right? Why do you expect everything of Israel and nothing of Qatar? How on earth can you call for a ceasefire without demanding the immediate release of the hostages? Right. I don't know where it's going to get you, that's probably as far as I can go. I mean, we are a nonpartisan nonprofit, right? And so can't tell people like how to vote but you can certainly use your voice. But I can tell you that Klobuchar and Smith really need to hear from people. They need to hear that the angry few who I don't know what they do. They seem to have infinite amounts of time. That they don't speak for most Minnesotans who are just, honestly just trying to earn a living, right? Take care of their family, and just go about their lives.
Ethan, I want to thank you for being here today and taking time to talk to us. I want you to know that you can consider us a resource. Should you ever need to come back on, we would welcome to have you back on under any circumstances. I hope the circumstances we have you on are better in the future, but please know you can rely on us to be a resource. Should you need to talk and help, we can be helpful in getting subject material out, interviewing you or anyone from your organization or anyone else to be supportive to what you're dealing with and what the world is dealing with right now. So I just want to thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Mike. I mean, really appreciated the conversation. It's been great.
Jeff, we just spoke with Ethan Roberts from the JCRC, and we spoke with Mike Zipko, who offered a perspective on media and public affairs about media coverage and everything. Give me your take on the conversation with Ethan.
That was like a lot of the conversations we have. I think it was maybe not the most fun conversation, but an important conversation. There was a lot of tough stuff to hear.
Do you feel it? May I say, I feel that we have a responsibility to do this. And as much as we could talk about other things, it seems disrespectful to not cover these topics, right?
Well, I think the I've made this point a few times now. I hate to keep beating the dead horse, but these things exist in the abstract. It's very easy to read, to skim the headlines, to read some words in a story and just kind of take that and just go, okay, you take it in as fact, but you don't really stop and think about it. And having these longer conversations with people and hearing their stories and hearing their emotions and hearing the details forces you in some ways to really internalize what are they talking about. They're literally talking about kidnapping children in front of their parents. They're literally talking about killing parents in front of their children and then kidnapping those children. That actually happened. Those are actual things that happen to actual children in the world. And that is and that it didn't happen in the abstract. It happened far away from where we live, but it didn't happen. It's not a movie script. It's not it's that happened to people. It happened to people that that Ethan's probably a few degrees separated from, friends of friends. And so it's not abstract, it's very real. And so when you look at that and you really understand it, you start to see what the Minneapolis Federation of Teachers did through a new lens and exactly how evil that was and exactly how bad what they did was. The Ethan said a lot of horrible things. Not 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 that he was bad, but I mean he described a lot of horrible things. One of the things that hit me the hardest was the juxtaposition between him at his ending talking about how he loves to be Jewish and then talking about students in the Minneapolis school district who are hiding the fact that they're Jewish now. There's been a lot of energy expended, particularly in the public school system, about people embracing who they are and having the right to be who they are, and a lot of it around sexual orientation or things like that, right? You have a lot of teachers standing up, and kids have the right to be safe at school, and they have this. And then on the flip side, you have the teachers union literally taking a stance that makes kids feel like they need to hide who they are, that they can't embrace who they are, an intrinsic part of who they are. That's how they were born. There is no debate about the fact, there is no scientific question as to, you were born Jewish, you were born into a Jewish family. And now you have to hide who you are because a group of the teachers at your school, who are supposed to be these adults who are looking out for you, but issue this hateful statement basically saying that they hate you for who you are. And now you have to hide yourself because these teachers are so backwards. It's enraging to me. And I cannot imagine. Thank God for my kids' school and the fact that I am in a position to send my kids to a place where they are appreciated. I could not imagine being a Jewish family, having your kids in the Minneapolis public schools during this time. It's unimaginable to me how awful that must be.
I was most taken aback by that. It was very difficult to hear. Many of the things that Ethan said were incredibly difficult to hear. We have covered this subject on this podcast. This is the third episode. This was incredibly difficult, but I also think it's important, and we have choices of what we cover. But I'm very appreciative that Ethan was willing to come on. I'm very appreciative of you, Jeff, and Mike for coming on. This is not easy material. We're diving into subjects that are very difficult, and Ethan, this is his life. And it was for Jacob Millner, it was his life. And for Norm Coleman, it was his life. This is what they're dealing with 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We have to deal with it. We can, in some ways, pick and choose when we deal with it based on, what we're watching on TV, what we choose what we choose to watch, how we choose to just participate and view and observe this terrible, terrible situation that Israel is dealing with right now in relationship to Hamas and just the world overall. It is very difficult. And the fact that there are students in Minneapolis, as you articulated, and I won't repeat what you said because you said it better than I did. It's just appalling to think about. But I'm very appreciative that we have this space to have these conversations. I hope that people listen, and by elevating Ethan's voice and allowing him to speak from his truth, his view, his perspective on this, I think hopefully will change some of the perspective that people have. When I heard about this resolution, I immediately thought I separated the two issues, in which I have the luxury of doing. I separated it from the standpoint of, why is the school district weighing into this issue? And then the ugliness of their message. It's important to get into both, because it's pretty clear that the process by which they had selective bias in terms of their desire to weigh into this issue, number one. Then they used, I think, probably a less than transparent process to get this through. And then third, it's the brutality of the message. And I understand to Ethan's organization and to a lot of people, it's the brutality of the message that should get the focus. But part of the reason I wanted to break it down further with you is because I think how this message came about, how it was constructed, the format in which it was presented, also shows a lack of respect, a level of anti-Semitism, a level of bias and hatred towards Jewish students, Jewish parents, Jewish teachers, and the entire Jewish community served by the Minneapolis public school system, and that anyone that comes in contact with the Minneapolis Federation of Teachers. It's just horrific to think. I cannot imagine what Ethan is going through and his organization, other members of the Jewish community, as he was talking about the 80%. But you just look exhausted. I mean, you look exhausted. And as the conversation went on, both Mike looked exhausted. I broke down at one point hearing Ethan speak. It's important that we still do this. And I don't want to take anything away from anyone else's trauma and pain that they're going through. But we're a podcast, and we want to do everything we can on the side of good against the fight of evil, and providing Ethan a platform by which to speak and talk about the good and what needs to be done, and providing a platform for his organization to have a voice was incredibly important. But make no mistake about it, it is very difficult here.
Should I write to my member of Congress?
You should.
Do you think it's going to do? You think it's going to do any good for anyone who doesn't know? I live in the 5th congressional district, Ilhan Omar's district. I feel like there's not any amount of constituent feedback that could move her off of her position. She was one of the first to rush and state that Israel had bombed a hospital and killed, was it 500, 5,000? I don't know, whatever made up number of people that didn't die during an attack that was later proven not to have come from Israel. She's very quiet on her corrections, though, when they come through. So
I will also say, I don't want to take too much more of your time, Jeff, but just from a perspective of social media, the amount of misinformation that has come out from people that should know better, that have election certificates, and people of much more prominence and significance in this discussion, in this debate, in this conflict than you or I, has been simply astounding. And the lack of willingness to correct and provide accurate information. I'm so fortunate that our perspectives, Becky's perspective, Mike's perspective on the use of social media, has always been to be responsible and put out accurate information. Yes, we have a bias, we have an agenda through our lens and our perspective. We have taken a very strong position on this podcast that we want to ensure every organization on the side of Israel, on the side of ensuring that every hostage gets home, and every person that's on the side of in opposition to what Hamas and other terrorist organizations in the Middle East are doing, to the degree which we can be helpful on our podcast, we will be. But I'm just very appreciative that we could have that discussion today. And to our listeners out there, both Jeff and I know Mike, it was just very difficult to listen to. And the only reason I bring that up is because I hope people take from that the seriousness of the topic. It's very serious, and every word that Ethan said was important and should be listened to. So, Jeff, I appreciate you taking time out of your day to talk about these issues with Mike and I and with Ethan. We want to thank you for listening to The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky. Before we go, show some love for your favorite podcast by leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts or on the platform where you listen. You can leave a review or give us a shout out on our website or across all social media platforms at BBBreakPod. The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky will return next week. Thank you again for listening.